Hey everyone! Welcome to episode 323 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen with your host, Matt Payne. On today's episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with photographer Jeff Zias about innovation and design thinking and how these concepts intersect with landscape and nature photography. I think you'll get a lot out of our discussion today, so enjoy. Before we get rolling, I want to remind listeners that we have officially opened submissions for Year 3 of the Natural Landscape Photography Awards. NLPA is the premier nature photography competition which we created to provide a platform for photographers looking for a way to showcase their nature and landscape photographs which have been edited with realism in mind. If you value this type of presentation in your work, then NLPA is your go-to competition. We have lots of rules that other competitions do not have, and we check every single raw file or film negative of every single potential winning image, ensuring that they adhere to our rigorous rules. If you'd like to learn more, please head over to naturallandscapeawards.com to get started. We close entries at the end of July, so time is running out. Best of luck. Okay, let's get to this week's episode with Jeff Zias.
Thanks, Matt. It's really an honor to be on. I'm a big fan of the show, and you've had amazing guests, so it's intimidating, but also exciting, and I'm humbled.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. When you reached out to me with the topic ideas, I was really intrigued by it, so I think we're going to have a great time today.
Me too. Great.
Awesome. Well, so Jeff, for people that may not know you or be familiar with your photography, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Great. Well, people largely won't be familiar with my photography. I'm an amateur photographer who has been and still is actually a technologist. So I live in California. I've been here for forever. I've been working here for the past 40 or so years. Basically married, have 3 adult children, and really wasn't all that interested in photography at all until about 5 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And I can explain what happened and what changed, but don't worry, it's not that I'm currently disinterested in photography. I love it. It became a passion of mine, and that just came through a certain set of circumstances. But what I do for a living is innovation coaching. So what I was talking to you about previously was I actually wanted to see if it was interesting to anyone other than myself, especially someone who knows photography very, very well, of some of the innovation practices and how they might apply to photography, because I've seen a strong connection the past few years. So that's my connection to photography. I love keeping it, honestly, as a hobby, because my other strong avocation, the thing I keep as a hobby, I don't try to make a living at, is music. And I discovered years ago when I started playing lots of music jobs that it kind of ruined the fun for me.
Oh, yeah.
So I was literally playing, it's like the wedding band problem. I was literally doing commercial things that kept me from being an actual jazz musician. So with photography, I just love keeping it in the corner of, hey, I can shoot what I want and I can process it the way I want. So that's what photography is to me right now.
I love it. And so just real quick, tell us, how did you even get interested in photography?
Yeah, it's a surprising story, at least to myself, which is about 5 years ago, a team I'm on at work, we're all basically innovation practices people, coaches, people who work with product teams and focus on, how can we be creative and be customer focused and make better products. I've done that largely within companies over the years. I started at Apple many decades ago, did startup companies, and I've been at Intuit for quite a number of years. So, and do a little help outside of the company and talking at universities here and there. But largely internal work within a company, and a lot of the coaching and the instruction and trying to help teams do better with customer-centric innovation comes down to coaching and learning and development. So teaching. And so a few of us on the team decided that, well, we should get some empathy for what it's like to, as an adult professional, to learn something, to be taught something, and then get a sense of what works for us. So different people on the team, like one guy decided he was going to learn the martial arts. So he wanted to, I think it was Kung Fu. And he said he's going to go down to a gym and get an instructor and take classes and then feel like what worked for him. Was it all immersive or the theory or the practice? And just experience what it's like to learn something you don't know at all, you're not good at. And I thought about what I might look into. And it was kind of interesting in that I didn't want to do music because I played music in local bands for decades and I know it, well to a certain extent. And I thought I would have to get a certain type of instruction and it wouldn't be a typical thing. And I thought, well, I'm a really bad photographer and I don't really care about it that much. Like I'll take some snapshots when we go on vacation.
Right.
And it seems extremely highly available to go out and get instruction. Like I wouldn't have to go down to some gym. Like I was even,
Right.
I didn't want to do what he was doing. Like I was
Right.
lazier than that. I thought I can probably, I think I get all these emails about Creative Live. I could probably just buy a couple Creative Live, courses or look at YouTube's. I figured that out later,
It's
but it's
slightly less dangerous than kung fu as well.
absolutely. Oh yeah. He ran into some problems. I could get to that later. Probably quite a bit less dangerous, except maybe for wave photography. But anyway, yeah. So I didn't have much interest really. I started. I think I started with, well, looks like there's a Creative Live course from Kathleen Clemens on flower photography.
Hmm.
I'll shoot some of those, and my wife might even like the picture, right? And it didn't take too many courses before I actually started to really enjoy it. And then it became a lesson for myself in fostering passion. Like the more I did it, the more I liked it. And then the real breakthrough, I think the short story would be, I'm pretty sure I didn't even know what type of photography I liked. I was totally wrong. I thought maybe I would like cityscapes and I would go out and have like a mediocre time shooting buildings. And I thought, okay, we have a big vacation to Paris coming up. So I watched a bunch of Serge Ramelli YouTubes on, he's from Paris, on like how to use Lightroom to process your Parisian photos, and I still didn't really know what I was doing. And I sort of enjoyed it. And all of a sudden I was watching a Thomas Heaton video. And next thing I knew, like 12 minutes had gone by and I felt really relaxed. And I just really loved what I was looking at. It was almost like the old days of looking at Animal Planet, what a bit like, PBS specials on the outdoors and
Right.
nature. And I just had that feeling of, oh, well, maybe I actually like landscape photography. And so anyway, I started emulating what I was seeing in some of those videos, and that turned out to be the thing I was interested in. And then my passion for photography really took off even more from that point.
Right. Okay. Okay. Well, that's good background, and I think that'll help inform some of our conversation. So, well, let's just dive right in. I know when you first reached out, you wanted to share how your innovation background in what you call design thinking has helped you as a photographer, and I would love for you to first just tell us what design thinking is in a nutshell.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, an easy way to think about design thinking is to think of it as a framework for problem solving. That's fairly general, so I'll have to describe a little bit more, I believe, in terms of what that really means. But I think a close cousin of problem solving is learning. So design thinking, the way it originated, is really all about, hey, look, if you're applying creativity, if you're solving difficult problems, first of all, be customer centric. Like, who are you solving the problem for? And it sounds really basic, but if you look at the way a lot of companies operate and a lot of organizations operate, they don't operate that way at all. And we could talk about why. For me, it comes from evolutionary psychology. You probably have some things to say about that. It's like, it's actually not the most natural thing for people to really have empathy for what they're solving and who they're solving for. So design thinking really emphasizes that. So the way I describe it to people initially is one way of thinking of it is a three-prong attack or three sets of principles. The one would be the first to mention is deep customer empathy. So if you're going to solve a problem, do you really understand what the problem is and who you're solving for and what those people or what that person even really cares about? And the theory of the case is you actually probably can't solve well at all unless you're extremely lucky if you don't really understand what the struggles are and what the empathy for those people is. So that's number one, deep customer empathy. Number two would be what we call go broad to go narrow. And what that's talking about is we're fighting this psychology of people like to lock into a solution. And what's even better is if it's your solution, like we all love our own ideas. So it's like, I love my ideas. What I'm going to do, because I think the way people learn to survive initially was you've got a saber-toothed tiger running at you. You better very quickly arrive at a solution and take action. Otherwise you'll die.
Right.
Right. So our brains lock in. I call that solution lock in. You're going to very quickly lock into a solution. It may be based on 1,000 assumptions that are largely bad, but that's what you're good at. You're locking into a solution and then it's all over. That's what you will do. You will implement that solution. What's actually much better to do is you force yourself to go broad and consider a multitude of possible approaches before you then narrow down at some point to actually take action.
Right.
You will
Okay.
have to narrow down, decide what to do, make a decision. But this is the forcing yourself principle number two, like learn to go broad, learn to take a deep breath, step back and consider lots of ideas instead of locking it to one.
Yeah, and in my case, what I've found in my professional work, because I do that a lot as I lock in and I'm like a driver and I'm like, let's go, is I have to slow down and I have to ask other people to, okay, what am I missing? Tell me what your ideas are before we go with my idea, you know? So that resonates a lot with me.
Mhm. It's difficult, isn't it?
It is, for me especially.
I think it's very difficult for most people. What I've seen is that there seems to be some percentage of people who really can slow down and like to flexibly, broadly consider lots of things and like to listen to lots of other people and like to spend a lot of time on the problem rather than on the solution.
Yeah,
But that's a small percentage of the population, it seems. It's just not human nature.
I agree, yeah. And then what's the third?
The third is rapid experimentation, and like we're in a business context, but part of what I wanted to get feedback from you and where we started conversing was, hey, does this actually apply to photography and art? Because I actually think I learned some things where it does in a fairly, to me, in a meaningful way. But in the business context, we talk about it as rapid experimentation with customers. So now let's say you've got lots of empathy, you like really understand a problem. You've done good problem definition in the context of what people care about. Let's just say a customer cares about. You've gone broad. You considered all sorts of different solutions before you narrowed in terms of the things you might experiment with. Now, without experimentation, how do you know what actually works? You're just taking a guess. But if you can rapidly experiment and do inexpensive experiments, so this takes a lot of creativity in its own right. If you can experiment quickly and inexpensively, you can actually learn your way to solutions that work well, rather than the typical thing for an organization, which is to decide you've got a business goal, make an assumption, lock into the solution. Highest paid person will assert the solution, go build the solution, ship it, and then complete failure.
I have a concept that relates very well to that is in regards to photography, but I want to save it for later because I think it'll tie into one of my later questions and you can ask me about it. But I think
Mhm.
my initial reaction is yes, all three of those things will definitely apply to helping us become much better photographers. So let's continue.
Yeah, and I'm curious. I will ask. I'm very curious about the connection you make too.
Okay, okay. Well, so let's go back to the concept of deep empathy, and maybe tell us a little bit about how that might translate in terms of people looking to understand their audience, but also, and potentially more importantly, their photography subjects.
So the starting point, like I talked about, was okay, well, design thinking, this is a businessy thing, or at least a problem solving thing, and it's a customer centric thing. It actually evolved out of uh, the the design background of people doing. They used to call it human centered interaction, human centered design. So it started with that notion of like focus on a customer. So I initially thought, okay, the connection is obvious if what you're not asking about, which is you got a photography business. So let's say your sole focus, I know it's not. Let's say your sole focus was just the business end of photography. Then getting customer empathy would be obviously applicable because the more you understand who the buyer of your photographic goods or services is, the better product or service you would have. Let's leave it at that. Well, a connection I didn't make at all initially was, oh yeah, but I want to be an amateur. I'm an engineer by background. I spent years and years being a software engineer and management of that before I figured out, hey, I can make a living coaching innovation and driving more of the touchy feely human centered side of things. So how would this relate in terms of creativity and the artistic aspect of photography? And then what I learned from studying photography, from a lot of these, like we were talking about, creative live videos, YouTube's,
Right, right.
podcasts, is like lots of great ways to learn that I think we've all discovered at this point. I started hearing people talking about, well, like an artist will not care about the buyer or even maybe the social media feedback of the number of likes or anything like that. It's not about validating externally what somebody else wants from you. It's about understanding yourself and what you authentically care about. And for me, the connection then became, okay, well, what might help my photography, like, yeah, I want to focus on the art. Like I started realizing, okay, what's exciting to me when I go out on these hikes now, and I've learned that it's fun and beautiful to be out there. And then maybe what I really enjoy then is finding a composition that kind of resonates with me a certain way, and then examining it from different angles and whatnot. Like, so for me, those are starting to be clearly the things that I enjoy the most. So what matters now starts looking like self-empathy, like being able to pay attention to my own feelings. And like I said, being a little bit vulnerable here, I was really bad at caring about or paying attention to my own feelings. That was like stupid. That was like
Right.
not solving a software problem, right?
Right. Sounds like an engineer.
Yeah, right. I had that engineer thing going still, and hadn't fully made the taken the blue pill or whatever and made the crossover.
Right, right.
So so to me that was the connection, which was okay, well, yeah, even I can sort of feel it. Like, what do I care about in the current situation I'm in? If I'm going to make a photograph now, what is it in this scene that I care about? And I think you had mentioned subject, and that's great because one form of empathy that I think applies really well is like, what am I feeling? And therefore, how can I authentically identify even a story I want to tell? And by the way, storytelling is an intrinsic part of design thinking. So that
Oh,
was
okay.
another aha moment. It's like, oh, for years people have talked about when you play a jazz solo, tell a story. I'm not sure what they're talking about. Or like, when you put together a set of photographs, tell a story. I didn't actually get it, at the time. And but in applying design thinking, what I started realizing was what I want to communicate, if it has a lot to do with how I'm feeling about the situation and what I care about and why, and empathy for the subject. And I think I might have a couple examples because that's a little abstract, but empathy for the subject, then I'm actually applying design thinking to photography at this point.
Right. Yeah, and I'm wondering too, empathy for a subject can take on lots of different forms. It could be having a more curiosity about what is this plant or what is this bird or how did these rocks form, like, and then getting that curiosity about the subject then gets you more excited about it, and then in my experience you become more in tune with it and you make better photographs of it. So I think it completely applies.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually, you probably have lots of ready examples. So, maybe I'll ask you that it doesn't have to be the last time you went out, but some recent time you went out, what, can you recall a subject you were focusing on?
Oh yeah, well I just got back from 10 days in northern Spain, so it's very fresh.
Yeah,
And
fantastic.
I spent a lot of time on this very specific beach that's kind of known for these really interesting abstract patterns and things like that. And I got really interested in the geology of how those rocks formed, and it just was such a fascinating place. And I was focused more on trying to tell that story of how, like, all the shapes of the rocks. And I mean, it's literally like this upside down layered rock that it was, you have layers of sediment, but on here it's like up like this, but then it's bending, and it's super surreal and abstract. So I was super focused on trying to understand how to tell that story.
That's a fantastic example. And now I'm thinking, I'm curious as to, it sounds like at some point in the past, you decided you were interested in that type of geology or geology in general. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I was a when I went to undergrad, my first major was geology. So I
Okay.
eventually went into psychology, but yeah, I've always been very fascinated with geology and have always had a strong interest in it. So spot on.
And so you had already actually gone deep to some degree in college.
A little bit.
And
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely identify, sedimentary, igneous, and conglomerate, and then I can understand a little bit about how different rocks form, and I can identify some rocks, like, but it's rusty. It's information that I can sort of tap into.
yeah, really interesting. So, it feels like in your case, you had some number of years ago, you had actually already identified, hey, here's something I care about. And you had already made the connection of how that can reflect and maybe even foster or enhance passion in your photography. Like you probably don't shoot rocks, you had already, I made the connection. And, in my case, it took a while for me to figure out and this is probably the case for a lot of people. There's an opportunity to figure out, well, given who I am and what I care about, how will that apply to my photography in terms of choosing subjects that I'm more interested in?
Yes. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm always drawn to geologic patterns, but I'm also really drawn to plants and the interaction with plants and their environment and things like that. So yeah, it
Yeah, and why
absolutely
limit
applies.
yourself, right? Unless for some reason you're an extreme specialist, it seems like, nature photography, here's a wonderful aspect. Like you can learn about aspects of nature for the rest of your life.
Exactly. Well, and I'm one of those people, I'm interested in so many different things that I don't think I could ever specialize in one thing because I'm so easily
Yeah.
distracted.
I
you
can,
know?
I can relate to it. I have a little bit of a story along those lines because so I mentioned YouTubes and tutorials and all that. And the one during when the pandemic hit, I decided that, okay, everybody's stuck at home and maybe this has created an opportunity in a certain way or a certain set of ways. And I had just bought a photography book that Rachel Talabart put out. I know she appeared on your show, maybe multiple times, but at least once. And so I figured, well, she does a lot of exhibits and she sells books and prints. I wasn't even sure if she did workshops, but maybe because of the pandemic, when a lot of that stuff is temporarily ruined, for a photographer, maybe she's actually teaching lessons now. So I went on her website, and sure enough, there was verbiage along the line of, during the pandemic, decided to do private tutorials or something like that. So So I thought, well,
Yep.
this is a great opportunity and it will probably go away. And I think it probably has, when the world turns back on again. So basically I signed up for a time slot with her and she, I'd figure out, I love her photography. And I also had seen her on a number of podcasts and or YouTubes. And, she has a background in instruction, it's extremely intelligent. So I figure, okay, this is a great opportunity. Like I'm going to learn a lot in 1 hour. And so my first question, which was really for her, was actually really kind of a stupid one in retrospect was, hey, I watch all this instruction. First of all, she's a really good coach. She asked me about my goals. I talk about, well, my goals might be different than other people. My goals is to remain interested in photography the rest of my life. And at some point in the future, probably near,
Hmm.
I'll be retired. And how can I stay passionate about photography? And kind of what that said is the goals, which she helped me with quite a bit. My first question was, well, I've heard from all different directions that you need to specialize. And, because I want to be good. And if you get better and better at something, you probably like it more and more. And of course you need to specialize. And her answer would
Right. And she's a
exactly
hardcore
like who
specialist
could
for
be
sure.
more specialized. And she gave me a totally solid answer with zero delay, which is you don't need to specialize whatsoever. There's absolutely no need. In fact, I used examples like, but there's these other people like Ian Plant and Michael Shainbloom, and they just photograph everything. They just come right out. I consider them both, top of the world class photographers. They just talk about how they just shoot everything and love it. And she said, you don't have to specialize. Just don't even think about it. Just shoot whatever you want. It's not going to hold you back at all. She said she needs to specialize because in her business model, when somebody types in like wave photograph, she's got to be the first hit. So that's kind of what
Right.
she needs to be locked into, but it's more of a business model thing than anything else. And I don't have a by design, I don't have a business model for photography. So that was a really solid answer.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's dive more into the more kind of personal side of things. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about emotions. So, how do you know when you've had a true emotional response with your subject, and how do you find ways to have that translate into your
Yeah,
life?
it's a great question. And it's a little hard to instruct because it's just the feeling. But if I go back, I'll start top down, but hopefully get to a decent answer of the emotion, which is, I think it was Socrates who said something about an unexamined life is not worth living. And then I think the summary of that is something along the lines of know thyself. So anything that has to do with that philosophy or even mindfulness, I think has to do with being in touch with yourself and your own emotions. So for years, I had tried to be more mindful. And I'm one of these people who can't meditate well because, I can't sit there for 20 minutes and be mindful.
Oh yeah, I'm the same. I'm like I have to go do this. I need to go do that. Like I don't like
Yeah.
not doing
And,
something.
and so I felt like a failure there, right? It's like, well, how am I going to be in touch with myself and my feelings if I mean, come on, like in my mind, I'd like to be a Zen monk and I can't even sit still for 5 minutes and concentrate. So what I learned though were some other techniques, and this isn't the only way to get in touch with your feelings, but what worked for me was, you know what, you can have a mindfulness experience just looking around and noticing three things. That's like one exercise, three things. What do I see? I see a microphone that's not plugged in. I see a water bottle, stuff like that. You can have a 1 minute breathing break and just pay attention to your breathing. It doesn't have to be 20 minutes of pranayama or something like that, which I can't really do either.
Right.
But it's amazing. You can actually feel yourself change. And this one thing I noticed very early on. So I mean, the shorter answer is just about noticing. It's like giving yourself permission to really pay attention to yourself. Because I used to think things like that were selfish and ridiculous. And then I started realizing, no, they're actually quite
Mm.
worthwhile and they'll eventually maybe even make me a better person. Who knows? What helped out was looking at short mindfulness exercises and then understanding what can get me to a place where I'm actually more in touch with my emotions. And like I mentioned before, I realized that, oh, I should just go out hiking and take pictures. That's what this crop of largely British landscape photographers seem to be doing out in the Lake District, and more that boy, that looks like fun. And I've got the beach 45 minutes away, and I've got redwood and madrone forest 35 minutes away. I should do that. And then the first thing I noticed was I started studying. Okay, I like when people take long exposures, the, at the beach, and I noticed that I was totally in a flow state. Like just putting the camera in bulb mode and setting my 3-minute timer on my iPhone and just waiting was all of a sudden I realized I was more relaxed than I've been in years. So that was one identification. It's like, and after
Oh
a while, I
wow. Okay.
started to not even necessarily like super long exposure seascape photographs, but I liked the feeling I got when doing them. And I started realizing I wonder what else I could feel. And that evolved towards, hey, maybe I won't even take out my camera and shoot anything until I see something that's fairly exciting to me. So then it became more training towards what's actually exciting to me. This may not work for other types of photography. Like some people, it's a dark thing, right? They're photographing a disaster or pollution or whatever. But for me, just focusing on, I mean, it's a little
Right.
shallow. I largely focus on what do I find beautiful, right? When I'm out on a hike.
I I'm mostly the same way. I don't think there's
Yeah,
anything wrong with
I
it.
mean, it's wonderful, right? It's just it's not for everybody, but I think it's wonderful. So all I had to learn to do was honor my feeling of what I liked instead of like conversely. At one point, I got some coaching of, Jeff, you should not care what people think of your photograph. What you think of your image is all that matters. And then once I got that through my head, I started to realize that, okay, if I can just be in touch with what I like to shoot versus what I don't like to shoot, that might be actually the only emotional connection I need to at least to get started in terms of producing images I like.
I love that. And I'm curious, how does this tie into figuring out what our photography should be about? Because you said mostly capturing beauty, but I'm curious if you've had any aspirations for it
More
to be
broad
more
than
than that,
capturing beauty. Is that what you're asking about?
or less, more or less broad. I mean, maybe I mean,
Right.
that's
Yeah,
super
that
broad,
that is
but
broad. The other aspect of what motivates me here is just learning. And I went through a number of things in corporate life that had to do with like Strength Finder and like what are your strengths and what do you care about. And I found about for myself that
oh
I
right, yeah,
a
yeah.
couple things called one called input, one called learning, which is more of an obvious title, are strengths for me, not meaning that I'm brilliant or anything, but meaning that that's what gives me energy. So, so what keeps me pretty broad is that, and it's the opposite of the Rachel Talabar business model type situation, which is I can just like I on my website, now I've got generative AI images. I've got macro photography. I've got flower
Ah,
photography. I've got, you know, wide angle landscapes, just aerial from Hawaii, right? Like I just wanted to try everything because for me, what's energizing is the learning, and there's just an endless number of things that I actually find
mm-hmm.
interesting because I like the learning part of it as well as the doing. Especially the doing has to be
Gotcha.
uh, is associated with being out in nature. because I found like I like shooting cities if we're on vacation. We were recently in the Netherlands, and they have beautiful canals and windmills, and obviously, and that was fun.
Hmm.
But I'd still rather be learning all different aspects of nature photography. So for me, it's kind of makes sense to be very, very broad. But for someone else, I think focusing down, getting more and more specific, if this is their strength and if this is what really gets them going, then I can imagine them being in tune with that and getting more and more specific and going deeper within a subgenre or whatever could be the thing to do. And honestly, that's probably what would make them the best in the world, right?
Right.
I mean, I have to admit there's a real advantage to
Right.
that. And again, it's like, are you the best wave photographer in the world, or are you the best macro photographer in the world? But for me, that doesn't seem to make sense. What seems to make more sense is being out in nature and trying to learn more and more.
And it kind of goes back to know thyself. You've learned that about yourself, that that's what you enjoy the most, and you know that you have an attraction to learning and broad experimentation, and so like harnessing that strength seems to be a
Absolutely.
good way to
I don't
go.
know if I mean, to what extent do you see that in yourself when you think about your photography?
Everything you said resonates with me as well. I mean, I know what I like and what I don't like. I love mountains, and I've tried almost everything, and I know the things that I love, and I know the things that I'm like, yeah, it's sort of okay. I my one of my favorite things is just trying to like unlock a puzzle. Like if I come across the scene that I know it has photographic potential, I'm just trying to figure out how to arrange the elements so that it makes sense and conveys the right story or message. To me, that's super fun, and so I'm in tune with what I enjoy doing and the things that I love about nature, and I just try to
Yeah,
focus on those
perfect.
things. No pun intended. Yeah. Well, I'm curious for you, what roles have practice and failure each played in your photography journey?
So for me, yeah, it's easy to talk about my experience. Don't know how generally it applies, but coming from a music background, a couple things occurred to me early on. Like honestly, one of the first things that occurred to me is just knowing how to work your camera is actually fairly easy compared to learning to play trumpet or cello or something like on a musical instrument, you might spend the first 5 to 7 years just even being competent, having a great sound or something like that. And if
Right.
it takes you 7 years to learn the exposure triangle on your DSLR, that's probably not good, right? I mean, so there's some fundamental differences in terms of practice. So it's interesting you just talked about composition and unlocking the puzzle and finding the keys within the environment. To me, I'm probably oversimplifying what you're talking about, but to me, that's all like light and composition, and those to me those are the more complicated aspects of the art that can be practiced forever for the rest of our lives. Yeah. So to me,
Exactly. Yeah.
there's always something to practice. I mean, there's a really old famous musical analogy where many years ago that there was a guy named Pablo Casals, and I think he was regarded as the top cellist in the world. And he still practiced 5 hours a day. And they asked him why. You know, he's probably performing 2 hours every night and practicing 5 hours a day, and he's already the best cellist in the world. And his answer was, "Well, I think I'm getting better." It's just a terrific mindset, right? It's like to realize that if you have a growth mindset at all, then that means you're kind of fostering the notion of practice as something that gives you more energy and helps you learn and grow. And it's like a flywheel, right? It's like a wonderful thing. So I try to foster my interest in practice as much as possible.
Yeah, and for me, like I would encourage photographers because a lot of landscape and nature photographers have this idea in their head that they're there's only specific, they can only shoot in like golden hour, and the light has to be perfect, and you have to have amazing clouds, and if it's not good, then you're not even going to take your camera out. And what I would encourage people to do is like, even if the conditions aren't what you envisioned, you should take your camera out and practice and try different ideas and different techniques and arranging elements and composing. And like, okay, yeah, you might not get the photograph that you had in your mind's eye, but you're going to become a better photographer in the process, and like that's more important than getting that amazing image that you had,
I don't know if you think about this
envisioned.
consciously or subconsciously, but how do you think about practicing composition?
Oh yeah, all the time. I'm constantly looking at scenes, and I'm trying to figure out like if there's a better way to compose it than what I've originally found, and like what do I like about the composition that I found, and what do I dislike, and how can I improve upon it, and like and a lot of times for me it's placement of objects or shapes, or like the relationship and the sizes of those shapes, and like I get slightly better at it every year, but I feel like that's probably the one part of photography that I can always, 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 always get better at.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just a good
And
habit.
and what you were talking about, to me, that holds the elements of learning from failure. So, I think so to me, the value of failure is learning, and then failing a lot fast is learning fast. And it's almost I don't know if this is universal, but for me, it's the best way to learn by far, because otherwise I think I'm fine, right? Like if I don't fail, I don't really have a reason to learn or to change. And digital photography is actually just amazing. Like how many iterations you get, like
Oh yeah, instant
how many
feedback.
failures you can get so quickly, so inexpensively. So it's just amazing. It might be why so many people can. I mean, I don't know how you feel about it, but it seems like there's thousands, if not millions, of good photographers out there. And I imagine it's because it's so
Yeah,
easy to get so many reps in and fail tremendously so many times so quickly, and therefore learn.
yeah, I totally agree. I think that's why it's such an accessible art form especially from the technical side, because you have instant feedback on your image,
Hmm.
unless you're shooting film, which you know, good on you, I guess. I like getting that instant feedback because I like, you know, understanding how I can improve a photograph, either whether it be composition or exposure or whatever. So, or focus. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can improve in an image. So,
Yeah, and to me,
um,
failure, it's the embracing failure. Some people in the innovation space try to call it fail forward. And what I like to do is just reframe the whole
right,
thing as learning, and it's not even failure, because I mean, the connotations are so thick and powerful, it's hard to get out of your mind. It's like you're not failing, you just learn. Like, and what's the definition
right,
of a bad experiment? It's one you didn't learn anything from. So to me, it's the heart. It's
right.
at the heart of all learning, and the speed is everything. Because if you can only fail once, like if you can run one experiment a year, good luck to you. That's pretty horrible. Or at one point I decided I wanted to learn infrared photography, and I also decided I wanted to get a medium format
Hmm.
film camera. So it was a very ridiculous thing to do, right? Like I had the right black and white film, and I had the film camera that's this big old 6x6 Bronica, and I had the filter on it, and I was trying to learn the camera and infrared, and how to focus infrared all at the same time. And then I realized I'd shoot a roll and I'd wait a week and a half to get the results back. And it would cost money. And, I'd open up the envelope and there'd be a pure black frame, and maybe a few that came out. And then I started reading articles of other people who were much more intelligent than me saying, "Oh yeah, I only shoot infrared digital. It's just too hard with film." So it's like the speed of learning is everything.
Yeah, totally. Well, maybe this is a good segue to talk about that third piece that you had introduced earlier on, which is narrow and rapid experimentation. I'm curious how those two things might translate in our fieldcraft to create better photograph done.
So,
So,
my example would be if we can reframe photography as solving, I use myself an example. The problem I have, let's just say the problem I'm trying to solve is my photograph sucks, right? So there's a problem to solve. So the best way to solve this is to iterate quickly with different attempts, and so you can turn the failures into success. So you need some form of measurement. You need some form of inexpensive, hopefully rapid ways of trying different approaches. And in a nutshell, I'll stop there because I want to hear your example. But in a nutshell, that's the only way to get to a real solution. Like, how did I go from that ridiculously bad infrared photo that didn't make any sense and was composed wrong and was exposed wrong and focused wrong to a good infrared photo, right? I had to learn my way there with failure and iterations, within an experiment.
yeah, my example is so as I was saying, I was on the northern coast of Spain this last week, and I we spent a lot of time photographing in mixed conditions. So it would be like drizzling, and then it'd be sunny, and then it'd be overcast, but that'd be like within
Okay.
90 seconds, all in that time frame. And I was shooting a lot of these scenes where you'd have these crashing waves hitting this wall, and it was like high tide, and I found this really cool composition where I had these waves in the background that were like flowing through all these rocks, and then there was another rock that was like the face of this cliff here that had all these grooves in it where the water just kept eating it away over the decades and decades of time. And I wanted to like get both of those in the same frame with just the right amount of streaking water going through each part of it. And so what I found myself doing is experimenting with tons of different shutter speeds and tons of different ND filters and different variations of ND filters, and just trying to get the exact shutter speed. And of course, like the sun would come out, so then I'd have to switch filters or I'd have to change my ISO or whatever. But it was a lot of fun just experimenting with different settings just to get the exact look and feel that I had in my mind of what I wanted the scene to
Yeah.
look like.
Perfect example. Yeah, I remember the first probably instruction I ever got or saw on Seascape, shooting waves and the speed of water and whatnot. I was so excited when I can't remember who it was, what they were talking about, and I've tried all sorts of different shutter speeds and I've taken 100 different photos. I thought that's awesome. That's that's what should happen because I mean I'll ask you like what if you had if you had forced yourself to just decide on a shutter speed and an exposure and a filter and an aperture and whatever, and only take two shots, what would have happened?
Oh, I would have had a relatively boring, like super long exposure where everything was silky and smooth, which isn't, I don't mind that look sometimes, but for this particular scene, I needed something else. So, it depends on the subject and what you have in mind, but for this scene, I needed something that kind of it just showed the power of what was happening in the scene without totally blowing out what was happening. So I needed there to be enough action, but I didn't want it to look all like frozen either. So it was like this super in between spot. And I'm sure
Yeah,
I've guessed wrong.
exactly. Yeah, in the
you know?
innovation space, people
Yeah.
talk about, look, you got to be aware of your assumptions, and then the whole game is to invalidate your assumptions. So like in your example there, you made some wild assumptions about what was going to look the best, and those assumptions are generally just always wrong. It just can't compare to trying a bunch of things,
Right.
especially if it's fast and inexpensive to try a bunch of things.
Yeah, exactly. 100%. Well, let's shift gears a little bit. I would love for you to talk a little bit about how you think about photography as a
Yeah,
metaphor.
photography makes a great metaphor for people thinking about, like, for example, product innovation or doing something for people. Like anything that it has a physical manifestation, like sports or animals or photography obviously is rooted in physics at one level, helped quite a bit. So in fact, I've been exposed to this when I worked at Apple years and years ago. We had a consultant come in and like some kind of training, but he pulled out a slideshow, and started talking about photography and said, like, what you get to do is remember, look at things from four different perspectives. And then he showed, a scene shot from four different perspectives. And then I can't remember if he wanted to zooming, but that's another analogy that's quite useful, right? Like it could be the same scene, but obviously, let's imagine, I don't know, yeah, like a 18 to 200 lens or something like it. There are so many different ways of looking at
Right.
the subjects, uh, taking a different view within the scene. So I think that's quite useful for people to think about. Okay, it's all about the optics of a situation. That's one metaphor. It's about differences in perspective. It's about differences in lighting or reflection or zoom in, zoom out. That's literally a tool we use sometimes in innovation, which is, okay, now let's zoom out and look more at the broader market. Let's zoom way in and look at one customer, Matt, like what does he need? So things like that. Some of that's cliched and trite. Some of the less cliched ones are, I we did a little lunchtime fun thing once at work where I showed people intentional camera motion. It's like, one person's, she used to be a photojournalist, I think, actually for the New York Times. And she was saying, yeah, this is really cool because I, I, photographs need to be sharp. And what you were talking about the whole time was the complete opposite, right? So just the notion that there are things in photography or art that get you looking at opposites is actually quite useful in terms of creative thinking.
Right. Yeah, I actually had an example like that on my trip to Spain. I'm trying to remember what it was, but I had found a scene that there must have been, I think it was like wildflowers, and they didn't look super interesting, like sharp and in focus. But when I threw them out of focus, they looked really interesting with the water that they were reflecting in. So I was like, oh, I'm just gonna do that. And so for me, it was just like, if you just try to make everything sharp, sometimes you miss
Absolutely.
out on a better photograph.
That's another
You
innovation
know.
lesson, which is you have to
So
be courageous because there's probably a lot of people that would, it's like, no, we talked about this, Matt. It's got to be front to back sharp.
it's got to be sharp, right? Why
Yeah,
didn't you
that was
focus stack
wrong.
that whole scene? What's wrong with you? Right. Yeah, there's no such thing as wrong, man. I do the opposite now. I'm like, oh, I'm just gonna do what seems interesting and fun, and if the end result is cool, that's nice. I mean, a lot of times the results aren't good, but I don't care. It's like you're innovating and you're trying new things and you're building
Hmm.
on your what you have
Totally. Yeah.
going
All the
on. So
forces just pull us to the
yeah,
status quo. Like, and that's not going to be,
right. Yeah,
that's
yeah.
suboptimal for creativity and innovation.
Well, so I'm curious then in your work with creatives as a coach, how have these approaches in photography helped you be a better coach in the innovative
So
industries?
one thing that's been really helpful is I think it's where I started describing how I even started to like photography, which was it's all about learning. So I got empathy for people learning things because then I remember back, oh yeah, my first year of learning about photography, everything was HDR, the saturation slider was all the way to the right, and just like everybody does, right? And it's like, yeah, well,
Yes.
it's quite clearly I really sucked and I had no idea. So one thing, just more in the category of learning, like the learning ladder, was experiencing for myself what it was to go from unconsciously incompetent to that whole progression until you're finally unconsciously competent, and what that takes, and then therefore what we're putting people through when we try to coach them in innovation. We're basically telling them to do things that are unnatural and might put them behind schedule and may not get them the biggest bonus. And And there's all sorts of problems with the environment just based
Right.
on human nature, all sorts of reasons like we just talked about that would pull you back towards front to back sharp, status quo, got to do things the way I've always done this. You know, I work with professionals who've had great careers and done things a certain way for the past 5, 10, 20 years. Those ways actually don't work any longer. Just think about generative AI actually, and a lot of
Right.
jobs out there. So, but there are no cues that tell them to work differently until maybe it's too late. So a lot of what we do is try. We have to have
Right.
stories and
Right.
metaphors and examples to get people to work differently than they ever did before. And learning photography and using photography as a metaphor and thinking about how people absorb new concepts, like the way I had to absorb new concepts about something I was really bad at, has been useful.
Awesome. All right. Well, last couple of questions. The first one is, would love for you to tell us about your books on innovation.
The only new thing coming out, it just came out last week, was a second edition of an innovation book that I co-authored. And the interesting thing, at least to me, about that was it's called The Entrepreneur's Journey. So it's about innovating within an organization. So entrepreneurism, being entrepreneurial, I believe Steve Jobs gets the credit for inventing that word or twisting the entrepreneur word into entrepreneur. And so, it may not be generally interesting to photographers, but if you innovate within an organization, that's what that book's targeted at. And the fun part of the second edition is my co-author is originally from South Africa, and we decided to make an international version of the book. So we got two more co-authors who are both business professors in South Africa, and they changed the book to be more Pan-Africa oriented. So the parables and business examples in there are all from
Oh, wow.
uh, across the continent, but generally more internationally interesting. So that's the new book coming out, and I could give you a link to that. Again, I'm not really selling it here. It's not a photography
Yeah,
book,
yeah.
but it is on the topic of how to innovate better.
Which I think we've proven relates directly to creativity and probably making better photographs.
Yeah,
So I think it is
thank you
relevant.
for that. Yeah,
Don't sell yourself
there
short. Yeah.
is there's a 6 point model in there, and one of the points is design thinking. Another one of the points is experimentation. So that's part of the overall environment for innovating well. The photography book, it's something
Love
I
it.
put out self-produced about a year ago, and I could give you a link to that. It's available on Amazon. And what I did is I really put, in terms of what I'm excited about, I do love the coastline. So I call it Along the Coast. And it's mainly black and white. I just got into that vibe. I was also, and still am, a lover of infrared photography. So, of course, inspired by Ansel Adams, like everybody and whatnot. So fairly, a lot of
Of course.
IR, fairly high contrast shots of the coast, but we get a lot of really interesting clouds and fog around here. So that's the book on photography that I have out.
Awesome. Yeah, well, definitely we'll put that in the show notes for sure. All right. Last question. Who
Yeah,
do you
so I
recommend?
spent some time out on the Frames magazine Facebook group at one point.
Oh, yeah. That's kind of a hellscape.
Yeah, but oh man, yeah, we could talk about social media in general. But so there's everything out there. Oh my gosh, I just went through a whole thing with the astrophotography group out there, but which is can really get rough on people. But I I really enjoyed interaction with a number of people out there. So the people I've recommended are people I don't think I've ever seen on your show or any show that's kind of like at you know your podcast level, but people who I thought were making very interesting photographs in a creative way and also had interesting things to say. So one is a guy who he has a background in design and has worked a lot or I think his whole career has been visual design, graphical design, which I always find interesting too, because I'm kind of an engineer who's probably a frustrated graphic designer initially. But so a guy named Shane McGeehan, and he's done quite a bit of creative work. Uh, I don't know how much he pursues photography as opposed to graphic design, but he gave me a lot of interesting support and feedback and encouragement out on Frames magazine. Another one is Andrew Hill, and yeah, talk about not worrying about sharp focus. So he's a landscape photographer. He must be in the Lake District. It has that look to it, but a lot of his photographs are very, very interesting in terms of how they're very soft and artistic, and just have that very warm feeling with rolling hills and sheep, and I just love that. Oh, I'm
And
sorry,
it's
Adrian.
Andrew or
Thank
Adrian?
you, Adrian Hill. Yeah,
Adrian. Okay.
Adrian
Yeah,
Hill.
no
I've
worries.
really enjoyed
Yeah,
his
okay.
photographs. Again, I haven't heard him on a show, so I don't know how if he enjoys talking about photography, but his photographs are fairly unique and just a lot of fun to look at. And then Lynn Blouch, I mentioned doing ICM, so intentional camera motion. I think she's done a number of things, but some people just have that feel where what comes out is so impressionistic and so smooth. I wonder how did they do that? Mine don't quite look like that. So anyway, I think she has an especially excellent
Right.
touch for very subtle ICM images. So I'd recommend her.
Nice. All right. Well, Jeff, this has been awesome, and I think people can definitely get a lot out of design thinking and applying it to their approach to photography and make
Fantastic.
better
Yeah, thanks
images.
very much, Matt. I really enjoyed talking with you about all these topics.
Well, thank you to Jeff for the wonderful chat on the podcast today. I really enjoyed it, and I hope that our listeners did as well. Keep up the great work. If you enjoyed our chat and you find value in this podcast, please consider supporting my work on Patreon. I operate on the value for value model, which means that I provide this content to you for free with the expectation that you pay me what you think it's worth to you. Only you know what that number is, and only you know what your budget is, so we have lots of tiers that you can pick from to support us. Since photography is now my full-time job, I'd really appreciate your support. Please go to patreon.com/fstop and listen to join, or look for a link in the show notes. Thank you so much. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.